I wasn't looking for anything. That's the part I keep coming back to. I was digging through my husband's home office filing cabinet on a Wednesday afternoon in March, looking for our mortgage refinance documents. Our loan officer needed a folder. I thought Kevin had filed somewhere in the bottom drawer. I was on my knees on the carpet, pulling folders out one by one, reading the plastic tabs. Insurance, taxes 2023, car title, and then one that just said Ridgeline. If you are new here, we narrate the craziest real stories people have shared online. New video every day. Hit subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Okay, here is what happened. I almost put it back. It didn't sound like anything related to our mortgage, but I opened it anyway because I was already holding it, and because that's what you do with folders. Inside was a Delaware LLC incorporation certificate, bank statements going back almost 3 years, and transfer records from accounts I'd never seen. The registered agent on the incorporation document was Kevin Ashworth. My husband, the other 50% member, was listed as Jenna Marie Coates. I didn't know that name. I assumed it was connected to Sentinel Shield Solutions, the cybersecurity company Kevin co-owned with his partner Dan. Kevin handled operations and client relationships. Dan handled the financial side and the technical systems. I'd met Dan maybe a dozen times at company events, always briefly. Quiet guy, polite, the kind of person who looks like he's running calculations even when he's making small talk. His wife, Jenna, came to some of those events too. Pleasant, never stayed long. Sentinel Shield had grown into something significant over the years. Kevin would mention it in that vague, proud way that meant he wanted credit without having to explain the details. $14 million in annual revenue, 47 employees, contracts with 3 hospital systems, 2 regional banks, and a defense subcontractor. They were the people companies called after a data breach, the people they hired to make sure it didn't happen again. Their entire business was built on one thing: trust. That word came up later in ways none of us expected. I should have called Kevin about the folder. That's what a normal person would do. Hey, what's this Ridgeline thing? But something stopped me. Not suspicion exactly, more like a recognition that I'd spent a lot of years not asking Kevin questions about money, about work, about the things he kept in his office, and that this habit of not asking had become so automatic that the fact I was even hesitating felt significant. Like I already knew the answer would be a lie, even though I couldn't have told you why. So I called Dan instead. I was nervous, almost apologetic. I told him I'd found some business documents in Kevin's filing cabinet, something called Ridgeline Consulting LLC, and asked if it was a company side project I just hadn't heard about. I told him I was worried about tax exposure. Dan went quiet, not the polite pause of someone thinking, the silence of someone whose world just shifted. I could hear him breathing. It lasted maybe 15 seconds, but it felt much longer. Then he thanked me, said he'd look into it, and hung up. I stood in Kevin's home office, holding that folder, and I knew. Not the details, not the scope, but I knew I had just handed Dan something that was going to change things for both of us, and probably not gently. The quality of his silence told me that. I found out later what happened on Dan's end of that phone call, why he went quiet. It's because Jenna Marie Coates is his wife's maiden name. I want you to sit with that for a moment. I called a man I barely knew to ask an innocent question about a business document, and what I actually did was hand him proof that his wife and his business partner had a secret company together. He stood in his kitchen, holding his phone, and his entire life rearranged itself in the silence before he thanked me and hung up. But before I tell you what Dan uncovered, I need to explain a detail about their partnership agreement. Because everything that happened next, the urgency, the terror, the race, all of it turns on a single clause. When Dan and Kevin incorporated Sentinel Shield back in 2015, they signed a partnership agreement that contained a morality and fraud provision. Section 14(3). If either partner was found to have committed fraud, embezzlement, or material financial misconduct against the company, the offending partner's equity stake could be purchased by the remaining partner for a price of $1. Kevin's own attorney had written that clause. He'd insisted on it, told Kevin it would protect him if Dan ever tried anything shady. Remember that, $1, because 2 men are about to race each other to use that same clause, and only one of them has real evidence. What Dan did next is what he does professionally. When companies suspect someone on the inside is stealing from them, Dan's firm builds the case in silence. They clone financial data, trace money flows, document everything without tipping off the insider. He designed that exact process, and now he was running it on his own company and his own wife, alone, from a laptop he bought with cash, so nothing would touch their network. He hired a forensic accountant named Patricia Morin and retained 3 attorneys. Sandra Liu at Henderson Family Law for the divorce, a criminal attorney specializing in white-collar fraud, and their corporate counsel for the Section 14. 3 proceedings. Patricia's forensic report would eventually run to 216 pages, documenting every fraudulent transaction with bank records, IP logs, and email correspondence. And over 2 weeks, Dan uncovered what I'd only glimpsed the edge of. Kevin wasn't the architect of the scheme. Jenna was. Dan told me this later, after everything had blown up, and I could hear in his voice what it cost him to say it out loud. Jenna had created the shell company in September 2022. She'd recruited Kevin. She'd set up the brokerage account at Charles Schwab, where the stolen money was being invested. Kevin's role was to initiate transfers from Sentinel Shield's operating account, because he had signatory authority on the business side. But Jenna managed everything on the receiving end. She picked the investments. She moved funds between accounts. She structured the payments to look like legitimate vendor expenses. And she had studied Dan's habits, not casually, not by glancing at a statement he left open on the kitchen counter. Methodically, she'd mapped out which expense categories he audited monthly versus quarterly versus annually. She knew which vendor codes he spot-checked and which ones he trusted his automated systems to flag. She designed the entire embezzlement scheme around the specific blind spots in Dan's own processes. His wife, the part-time dental hygienist, had been running a $500,000 operation from their kitchen table, while Dan helped their son with algebra homework in the next room. One of her text messages to Kevin, which came out during the divorce proceedings, said this: "Dan trusts his systems more than he trusts people." That's the gap. She was right about Dan. She was also right about me. Another message said, "Danielle doesn't pay attention to anything financial. She's not a risk." She was wrong about that one. But we'll get there. The total damage: 36 monthly payments of $3,200 to Ridgeline, disguised as subcontractor fees for a company that didn't exist in their vendor database. No W-9 on file, no signed contract, plus 14 separate wire transfers ranging from $8,000 to $41,000 each, all coded as equipment purchases or software licensing fees. $478,314, nearly $500,000. And the Schwab brokerage account had grown to $512,000 because Jenna turned out to be a competent investor. She was making returns on money she'd stolen from her own husband's company. Dan had the evidence. He had the clause. He had the attorneys. His plan was to take 8 to 10 weeks, build an airtight case, and use Section 14. 3 to buy Kevin out for $1. He thought he had all the time in the world. He didn't, and neither of us knew it yet. During week 3 of Dan's investigation, Patricia's firm made a mistake that nearly destroyed everything. One of her junior analysts sent a records verification request to the wrong branch of the bank, where Ridgeline held its account. Instead of going through proper legal channels, the request went directly to the branch manager, who happened to golf with Kevin, who gave Kevin a friendly phone call to let him know someone was pulling records on Ridgeline's financials. Dan had no idea Kevin had been tipped off. For 2 full weeks after the mistake, he walked around thinking he was invisible, smiling at Kevin in meetings, kissing Jenna goodnight, living this awful performance of normalcy, while his business partner was in full panic mode behind the scenes, scrambling to weaponize the same clause Dan was planning to use. Because here's what Kevin figured out. If he could fabricate evidence that Dan had committed financial misconduct first, even something that wouldn't hold up long-term, he could trigger Section 14. 3 against Dan. Force Dan to sell his shares in a $14 million company for $1. By the time Dan proved the evidence was fake, Kevin would own the company outright and could rewrite the books, make the Ridgeline trail disappear. The clause Dan was planning to use as a scalpel, Kevin was planning to use as a weapon. And Kevin had a 2-week head start that nobody knew about. Nobody except me, because I was watching. After that first phone call, I'd started doing something I'd spent my entire marriage avoiding. I started paying attention, not investigating exactly, just letting myself see what had been in front of me for years. The late nights Kevin claimed were client emergencies, the phone he kept locked and face down on every surface, the way he'd leave the room to take certain calls, the savings account that never seemed to grow despite two good incomes. I'd accepted every explanation he'd ever offered because the alternative required me to act, and I had been very comfortable not acting. But now I was watching, and about 5 weeks after my first call to Dan, I noticed Kevin's behavior change. More phone calls, more agitation. He was short with the kids. He started locking his home office door, which he'd never done before. Something had shifted. On a Thursday night, he was on the phone in his office for 3 straight hours. I could hear his muffled voice through the wall, the cadence of someone arguing, then pleading, then making plans. I did something my grandmother taught me when I was a girl. She grew up in a small house in West Virginia with thin walls and too many siblings. She used to press a drinking glass against the wall and put her ear to the base. The glass channels the vibrations, turns a muffle into words. I took a water glass from the nightstand, pressed it flat against our bedroom wall, the one that shares a surface with Kevin's office, and listened. I heard my husband say the word section 14.3, and Dan in the same sentence. He sounded scared, but he also sounded determined, like a man making plans he couldn't take back. I didn't know what section 14.3 was at the time, but I understood the tone. This wasn't problem solving. This was a man planning to destroy someone. I called Dan from the bathroom that night, whispering so Kevin wouldn't hear. I told him what I'd overheard. Section 14.3, his name, the tone of a man building something irreversible. That same silence again, the one I recognized from our first call, the silence of someone recalculating everything. Then he said, "Thank you, Danielle," and I could hear in his voice that I'd just told him something that terrified him. Dan understood immediately what Kevin was doing. The race I described at the beginning, 2 men sprinting toward the same clause with opposite evidence. Dan called every attorney he had that night. Sandra Liu at 11, Patricia at midnight, his criminal attorney at 6 the next morning. He told them all the same thing. Whatever we have ready, we file now. Not in 8 weeks. Not when it's perfect. Now. Patricia said the forensic report wasn't complete. She had 160 pages documented, but needed more time for the wire transfer analysis. Sandra said the divorce filing was ready, but the asset protection motions hadn't been drafted. The criminal attorney said he could get the DA referral submitted by Monday, but couldn't guarantee how fast formal charges would follow. Dan said do it all. File everything. Monday morning. Go with what we've got. That gave them the weekend. It gave me the weekend too, and I used it. Saturday morning. Kevin was in his home office with the door closed and the shredder running. Not a few pages here and there. 20 minutes of continuous shredding. The sound of a man destroying evidence, though I didn't know exactly what evidence yet. When he left to pick up lunch, I went into his office. The shredder bin was full of confetti, but the recycling bin under his desk had pages in it. He'd been sorting, apparently, shredding the most damaging documents, but recycling the ones he considered less critical. For a man who worked in cybersecurity, his operational security under pressure was remarkably sloppy. I pulled out 6 pages, printouts of Sentinel shields, accounts payable ledger. They had Kevin's handwriting all over them. He'd circled old transactions, ones that predated the Ridgeline fraud by years, and written annotations next to them. Dan approved. No second signature. Flagged for review. He was building a paper trail to frame Dan, taking legitimate historical transactions and annotating them to manufacture evidence of misconduct that never happened. I photographed every page, front and back. I texted the images to Dan. Dan's divorce attorney, Sandra Liu, told him those photographs were a gift. If Kevin filed his fraudulent 14.3 motion and they could prove the supporting evidence was fabricated, it would constitute fraud upon the court. Additional felony charges on top of the embezzlement. Sandra told Dan I had just handed them a grenade. I spent the rest of that weekend in a strange suspended state. I knew my marriage was ending. I had known it was ending since the filing cabinet, maybe longer. Maybe since the first time I chose not to ask Kevin where the money went. I knew the man I'd called 5 weeks earlier was about to destroy Kevin professionally and legally, and I had helped him do it, and I would do it again. That was the thing I kept testing, pressing on like a bruise to see if it still hurt. I kept asking myself if I regretted calling Dan, if I regretted the glass against the wall, if I regretted the recycling bin. And the answer was no every time. Not because I'm brave. I'm not brave. I just got tired of being the kind of person who doesn't look. Kevin didn't sleep Saturday night. I lay in bed, listening to him pace in his office, the floor creaking through the wall. I kept my breathing steady, and my eyes closed. I'd spent years being exactly this good at pretending to be asleep, while Kevin did things I chose not to see. One last performance. Sunday was worse. Jenna texted Kevin something that made him lock himself in his office for the entire afternoon. I didn't press the glass against the wall this time. I didn't need to. I already knew what was coming. And I knew that whatever Kevin was planning for Wednesday, Dan was going to get there first on Monday. Monday morning, June 2nd, 2025, Dan arrived at the Sentinel Shield offices at 5:30 a.m. He spent 2 hours, systematically, revoking every piece of access Kevin had. Keycard, disabled. Login credentials, revoked. Administrator privileges on every client network they managed, stripped. Signatory authority on the bank accounts, frozen. Then he placed a sealed envelope on the reception desk addressed to Kevin Ashworth, marked personal and confidential. I experienced that Monday from the other side. Kevin left for work at 8:15. He was wearing the blue shirt I'd ironed for him the night before. He kissed me on the cheek at the door, a quick peck, already somewhere else in his head. He had no idea that I was the reason his keycard was about to stop working, that the woman he'd kissed goodbye had given Dan the evidence to end him. Dan's divorce attorney served Jenna at her house at 8:15 that same morning. Kevin texted me 25 minutes after he left, just a question mark. Then, something weird with the door at the office. Then nothing for over an hour. What happened during that hour? Dan told me later. Kevin arrived at 8:40, held his keycard to the reader, and nothing happened. He tried it again, held it at different angles, the way you do when you think it's a bad read. Tried the side entrance. Nothing. Pulled out his phone and tried to remote into the building management dashboard, the system Dan had personally designed. Access denied. Dan watched on the security camera feed from his office. He told me there was a specific moment when Kevin understood. Not when the card failed, not when the door wouldn't open. It was when his phone showed access denied on a system he'd had admin rights to for 11 years. That was when his face changed. The receptionist handed Kevin the envelope and told him quietly that she'd been instructed not to allow him past the lobby. He opened it standing right there at the front desk. Inside were 3 documents. The Section 14. 3 buyout notice, formally exercising Dan's right to purchase Kevin's 50% equity stake in Sentinel Shield Solutions for $1. A letter from Dan's criminal attorney notifying him that a referral for 12 counts of wire fraud and 3 counts of embezzlement had been submitted to the Mecklenburg County District Attorney's Office, and the first 3 pages of Patricia's forensic report, showing the Ridgeline LLC incorporation with Kevin's name and Jenna's maiden name listed side by side as co-members. Dan told me Kevin's hands shook so badly, he dropped the papers on the floor. He didn't yell. He didn't pound on anything. He didn't demand to see Dan. He stood there for a moment staring at the pages scattered on the tile, then crouched down and picked them up one by one and put them back in the envelope. He thanked the receptionist. Then he walked outside and sat in his car in the parking lot for 45 minutes before driving away. Kevin came home that afternoon and didn't speak for 3 hours. He sat in the living room and stared at the wall. I didn't ask what happened. I already knew. When he finally looked at me, he said one sentence. "Someone's been talking to Dan." I held his gaze and said nothing. I wonder sometimes if he knew right then, if he could see it in my face. He never asked me directly, not during the divorce, not after. Maybe he didn't want the answer. Here's the timeline that still makes my hands cold. Kevin's attorney had been preparing his own Section 14. 3 motion against Dan, built on the fabricated evidence I'd photographed him preparing. The plan was to file it that Wednesday. Dan filed his on Monday. 72 hours. If I hadn't pressed a glass against the bedroom wall, if I hadn't pulled those pages from the recycling bin, Dan would have been blindsided. Kevin would have filed first, And even though the evidence was fabricated, the motion would have triggered an immediate freeze on Dan's access to the company. By the time Dan proved it was fake, Kevin could have restructured the books, buried the Ridgeline Trail, and made the real fraud disappear. Dan would be telling a very different story right now, and Kevin would own a $14 million company built on someone else's stolen work. Kevin retained defense counsel, but his own attorney, the one who had originally drafted Section 14.3 to protect Kevin, told him the clause was ironclad when backed by the forensic evidence. There was no angle to fight it. Kevin sold his 50% stake in a $14 million company for $1 on July 2nd, 2025. The DA filed formal charges the same week. 12 counts of wire fraud, 3 counts of embezzlement. His trial is set for October. He's facing up to 15 years. The Schwab brokerage account was frozen. Dan recovered $391,000 of the $478,000. The rest had been spent on the affair, a condo deposit in Wilmington, which I learned about in court documents along with everyone else. The usual sad inventory of a secret life that stops being secret all at once. Dan and Jenna's divorce was finalized on August 29th. Because of the documented fraud and Jenna's role as the architect, not just a participant but the person who created the shell company, recruited Kevin, and designed the scheme around Dan's own habits. The judge awarded Dan primary custody, the house, and 70% of marital assets. Sandra Liu earned every penny of her fee. During the proceedings, Jenna's text messages to Kevin were subpoenaed. The messages from early 2022 showed a woman systematically researching Delaware LLC formation laws, asking Kevin detailed questions about Sentinel Shield's vendor payment workflows, mapping out which expense categories Dan reviewed and when. She was methodical, patient. She studied the system and found the gap. And then she walked through it for 3 years while raising 2 children and keeping up the performance of a normal marriage. I read some of those messages during my own divorce proceedings because Kevin was referenced throughout. One of them was the message about me. Danielle doesn't pay attention to anything financial. She's not a risk. I sat in my attorney's office reading that on a printed page and thought about how right she'd been for so long and how wrong she was at the end. I hadn't paid attention to anything financial for our entire marriage until I went looking for mortgage papers in a filing cabinet. I filed for divorce from Kevin a week after everything came out. It wasn't a difficult decision. The difficult part was admitting how long I'd known something was wrong and how hard I'd worked not to see it. The late nights, the locked phone, the way our savings never seemed to grow. I'd accepted every excuse because the alternative was too frightening. It took a misfiled folder to make me stop accepting. Kevin sent Dan a handwritten letter after the buyout, 3 pages about how the affair just happened, how the money started as Jenna's idea, and he got in deeper than he intended. Based on the forensic evidence, that last part might actually be true. She was the architect, and he was the contractor. But that's in our defense. He was a grown man, with full knowledge of what he was doing every time he initiated a transfer. Dan read the letter once and fed it through the shredder at his office. Some people have asked Dan if the $1 buyout was too harsh. He tells them what he told me. Kevin was 72 hours from doing the exact same thing to him, except Kevin's version was built on fabricated evidence, documents he was hand-annotating to frame an innocent person for misconduct that never happened. Kevin wasn't planning to show mercy. He was planning to show Dan the door and keep everything. The only difference between what Kevin planned and what Dan did is that Dan's evidence was real. Jenna texts Dan at 2 in the morning sometimes. Long messages alternating between apologies and accusations, between begging for another chance and blaming him for working too much. He doesn't respond. His attorney says not to. And honestly, what do you say to the person who studied your habits like a system to be exploited, found the vulnerability, and walked through it for 3 years? Dan called me after it was all over. He was crying, which surprised me. Every time we'd spoken before he'd been controlled, precise, professional. This time his voice broke and he said, "You saved my company, Danielle. You saved my family, and I don't understand why you did it." I told him I wasn't sure either. Not entirely. Maybe it was because I was tired of being the woman who didn't look. Maybe it was because I could hear in his silence during that first phone call that whatever I'd found was going to hurt him badly. And I decided he deserved to see it coming. Maybe it was simpler. Maybe I just couldn't find the mortgage documents, and everything that happened after was the world's way of telling me to stop looking away. We talk regularly now. Not romantically, nothing like that, but we share something that's hard to explain to people who haven't lived through it. We were both betrayed by the same two people at the same time, and we both lost the version of our lives we thought we were living. He lost a wife and a business partner. I lost a husband, and whatever was left of the story, I'd been telling myself about my marriage. There's a kinship in that. Dan owns Sentinel Shield outright now. He just landed a $4.2 million contract for a new medical campus in Ballantyne. He's rebuilding. His son Marcus is 13 and asking harder questions about why mom left. His daughter Lily is 9 and just thinks dad has a bigger house now. My own kids are younger, more confused. I'm staying with my sister for now while I figure out what comes next. Kevin's out on bail, and we communicate only through attorneys. He has never acknowledged what I did, never asked if I was the one who told Dan, never accused me. I don't know if he's figured it out or if he just can't bring himself to ask. I'm not sure which answer I'd prefer. People ask me if I feel guilty for calling Dan, for the glass against the wall, for the recycling bin, for helping dismantle my own husband's life. I don't feel guilty. What I feel is something closer to grief for all the years I spent choosing not to hear what was on the other side of that wall. I was so practiced at not seeing things, so comfortable in the not knowing. And then I reached into a filing cabinet for mortgage documents, and my hand landed on a folder labeled Ridgeline, and I couldn't go back to being the person who doesn't look. 4 phone calls. That's what Dan tells people when he talks about me. 4 phone calls from a woman I barely knew saved everything I spent 11 years building. He says it like I'm some kind of hero, but the truth is, the first call was confusion, the second was fear, the third was anger, only the fourth one, the one where I photographed fabricated evidence from a recycling bin and texted it to a near stranger knowing exactly what it would do. Only that one was a real choice. So here's what I think about now. Not revenge against Kevin, not sadness about the marriage, which I think ended years before I found that folder. I think about how thin the margin was, how close Dan came to losing everything, because I almost didn't open that filing cabinet, because I almost called Kevin instead, because I almost ignored the sound of my husband's voice through the bedroom wall, because I almost left those pages in the recycling bin. And I think about Jenna's text message, the one about me. Danielle doesn't pay attention to anything financial. She's not a risk. She was right about everything else in that scheme. She studied every system, found every gap, exploited every blind spot. She was meticulous and patient and brilliant in the worst possible way. But she was wrong about me.